So the first thing I'm going to do for this example is I'm just going to set up a new composition. I can give it a name, puppet pin test, I'll call it. Doesn't really matter at this point though. Mainly what I want to look for on here is that my aspect ratio is an HD aspect ratio. So I'm going to change the width to 1920 and the height to 1080. And that gives me this HD TV 1080 setting, which is fine. My frame rate's okay. I'm okay with the square pixel. My resolution I can leave at full. The duration, right now it's set to a second or a minute. I'll just keep it at that for now. Maybe I'll make it a little longer. So if I need to change my composition, I can always go back into my composition settings and I'll just make it 5 seconds. So in After Effects, previously, we've looked at kind of how we can sort of create and move these basic shapes, right? That was the idea of our motion graphics project, was we had these sort of shapes and we could affect and animate the different properties of this object. So the transform properties, again, I could animate its position, so I could move it from its position on the screen anywhere I wanted. I could animate its scale, so I could move it up and down. I can move its anchor point using the anchor point tool. So I'm just going to put it right in the center, and now all of my animations will occur from that anchor point. I could affect its rotation, and I could affect its opacity. So those were the basic kind of transformations that we could do just using After Effects. And we looked at keyframing. So the animation will occur only when I kind of place keyframes, which in After Effects I do by turning on this stopwatch. So if I wanted to have this animation kind of scale up and down, I'll just turn on the stopwatch for scale. I'll move down on the timeline. I'll increase my scale. Another keyframe is created for me. And I could scale it back down again, right? So this is all review. I'm going to delete these keyframes for now. So that's kind of what we've done in After Effects, is create these sort of kind of simple motion graphics that we had graphic elements, and we weren't animating their individual kind of properties. We were just animating these transform properties. So we're going to look at a couple other things in future classes. One is 3D cameras. We'll look more into effects. But mainly what I wanted to talk about today was this tool called the Puppet Pin tool. The Puppet Pin tool basically allows you to create joints like you would on a puppet onto your animation, so you can also transform them that way. So the way that I would do that is the Puppet Pin tool is this kind of push pin like tool here on the top. So I would select that, and then I would just kind of place some pins onto this figure. We'll look at a more complicated figure in a minute, but for now, we'll just do this. So now, I can bend this figure and kind of animate it. So this is a step beyond what we were doing when we were kind of just animating an object's properties. So this kind of idea of this creating sort of joints in your figure becomes really handy when we go into 3D, because when we're working with 3D objects, this is pretty much the only way to create animation, is to create joints for your 3D objects. So pretend like this is an arm. I can kind of move it about. So, and I control the animation on this the same way that I control the animation for the other objects. So if I detail into my, you'll notice when I added those pins, this effects tab kind of appeared on my timeline. So now if I go into Puppet, and just keep kind of scrolling down, it'll give me my, it'll show me the different pins I created. So Puppet Pin 3 is up here, is the bottom one. Puppet Pin 2 is the middle one. Puppet Pin 1 is the top one. And I can rename these if I want. So like, let's say I wanted to call that top. You can do that. I can call this one middle, and I'll just call this one bottom.
Where is that?
Sorry?
Where are the puppet pins?
So the tool itself is this.
I mean the one on the bottom?
So if you, when you added those pins, when I added those pins, this effects tab became on my shape layer. So if I just detail into that and just keep going, it'll bring me under deform to bottom to the pins that I created. And then from there, I can animate these the same way that I would animate anything else. So let's say I wanted to animate this top puppet pin. I can just select it, and I'll hit the timeline or the stopwatch. So I'll turn it on. And if I move down my timeline, I can move the puppet pin. The same way that I would kind of animate an object's other properties. Like if I was doing the rotation and the scale, I can still do that. So now I have this animation that's that kind of figure just sort of bending like that, right? So if it's a little too bendy, you have this other tool. If you hold down on the puppet pin tool, you have this puppet starch tool. And so that looks like this little spray bottle. And what that's going to do is allow you to kind of starch sort of cells in your mesh so that they're stiffer. So I find with the puppet starch tool, it's helpful to look at the mesh. So if we click on this mesh button, it'll show us kind of the animation mesh that's being created. And if we just kind of click with our starch tool, we can stiffen up portions of this animation. So in my original animation, maybe I didn't like how bendy this bottom part was. I wanted it, you know, that movement. I wanted that kind of bottom half of this rectangle to be less mobile. I could use my mesh tool and just start clicking kind of on the parts that I don't want to move. And the more that I click, like if I click them multiple times, you'll see that the cells become darker. And wherever they're dark like that, the figure is not going to move so much, right? So now if I do this, you can see that that figure is not moving. And you can always, so let's say you can always kind of finesse how stiff you want this starch to be. If I want it to be more stiff, I'll pull the amount up to 55. And now that's really just not going to move at all. If I want it to be less stiff, I can pull that amount down to like 1, and then it'll have some give to it. But that's the basic idea of the puppet pin tool, is creating these joints, and then the parts you don't want to move, you use the Puppet Starch tool. So let's see what this looks like with a more figurative object, right? So here I have these two figures. So here's this wizard that I have in layers. And I'm just going to take his arm in and kind of demonstrate how to use the puppet pin tool. So the first step is to import. This is just a vector image in After Effects. And you can see that I kind of made the different elements their own layers. So my first step is to import this into After Effects. I don't know where it is. Let me find it. Wizards. All right, so here's my wizard.ai. I'm going to import it as a composition. And when I did that, I got all of the different layers, right? So let me find the layer, the arm layer. So I can just drop these on my timeline. So there's the hand. Here's the lower arm. So I can just bring these down and kind of position them where they should be. And the upper arm. All right. So now I'm going to use the puppet pin tool here. Let me actually kind of merge the layers on this arm. It might make this example a little bit easier. Forgetting how to merge these layers. Let me see if I can find it on here. I'm just going to copy them. I'll put them in a new project. Call it Wizard Arm. And I'll paste them in. So for this example, I wanted all of my layers to be one, just to kind of show you as an example. But using this technique, sometimes it's helpful to kind of isolate certain parts. Let me just save this. And I'm going to bring this into After Effects. What happened to my wizard arm? Did it not save it? Oh, it went into motion graphic. All right. Desktop. Motion graphic, wizard arm. So for this example, I just wanted it all as one layer, but sometimes you'll see when we're doing a full body that sometimes it's easier to have different elements in different layers. But here's my wizard arm. I can still transform its other properties, so I'm going to make it a little bit bigger. But let's say I kind of want to animate this arm moving. An easy way to do that is to go to my puppet pin tool, and making sure I have my wizard arm selected, I'm just going to put joints where joints kind of would be anatomically on an arm. So probably the hand would move, right? Because there's a wrist there. And maybe I want some motion to be in the middle. Maybe I want some motion to be in the top. So now when I look at my wizard arm, I have these effects, puppet, and under deform, I have my 3 different puppet pins that I created. So I can kind of see what that motion now would look like, right? If I was sort of moving this. So let's say I want to kind of just move that wrist up and down. I think I created some keyframes by accident. Yeah. So I'm just going to go to my puppet pin 3, and it highlights all of them for you. So I'm going to do that, and the keyframe is already on, and I'm just going to kind of keyframe that a little bit so it looks like this arm is moving up and down. So if I preview that, that's what I have, right? It kind of looks weird though, because it's sort of stretching and deforming in a way that a regular arm wouldn't necessarily do, right? So that's where I would use my puppet starch tool. So I'm going to grab that, and I already have the mesh checked. So it's showing me kind of the animation mesh that is being created. And then I'm going to maybe change my amount just to 15%. Really, the more you change this amount, the stiffer it's going to be. So I can see kind of when it moves, I don't want this upper arm to move that much because it makes it look weird. So I'll just add some starch there. And now it's moving less, right? So now it's not moving at all. but the bottom of this sleeve is still sort of funny, right? Like the way that it's distorting. So I may, maybe it will move more though. And again, when you're doing these things, think about the animation property. Think about how something would really move in real life. So maybe I want to make that less stiff. So I'll bring my amount down to 5%. And I'll just kind of put some starch sort of at the bottom there. Maybe a little bit at the top. So here I'm kind of creating like a puppet, and I'm just using that puppet starch tool to sort of stiffen the parts that look a little bit unnatural when I move it. So I can kind of move that arm. And then I can also animate, though, its other properties still. So imagine if this was attached to like a body, I can still animate its position at the same time. So let's say I kind of want it to move across the screen while that's happening. I can sort of move it. Let's say I want it to kind of rotate a little bit. I'll just turn on the keyframe for that and just sort of play with the rotation a little bit. So anyway, my point here is even using the puppet pin tool and the puppet starch tool, you can still sort of animate those other properties that we were looking at when we were kind of focused more on motion graphics. So what I'd like you to do for the remainder of the class, of which there is about another 40 minutes of, is draw something in Illustrator, like an arm or a leg that you can rig up as a puppet. If you are feeling ambitious, you can draw a whole human figure and use the puppet pin tool to rig up its skeleton or its joints. But for a simple example, maybe try drawing an arm or a wing and bring that into After Effects and use the puppet pin tool to create joints for it. All right? Oops. So you're going to draw kind of a limb or something simple in Illustrator that you're going to bring in to After Effects and start animating with the puppet pin tool.